Today at the National Press Club, the CEO of youth support organisation the Ted Noffs Foundation, Matt Noffs, and the co-director of mental health consultancy Connetica, John Mendoza. The pair will discuss youth crime and ways to address it. Matt Noffs and John Mendoza with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Youth crime is a disturbing spectre facing our country, both in its impact on communities and in our seeming inability to find a way of dealing with it. To discuss it today, two people who have had a long association with the issues. Both of them will speak and then we'll have a discussion. Professor John Mendoza, Adjunct Professor John Mendoza and Matt Noffs from the Ted Noffs Foundation are going to address us, and Adjunct Professor Mendoza will speak first, and I'd welcome him to the lectern.
Thank you for that introduction, Laura, and for the applause from the crowd here. Thank you for your attendance. This is an issue of national importance, as Laura said. I want to thank the National Press Club and the Westpac Foundation for hosting today. And I also want to acknowledge my partner and wife, Mariam Wands, who's here, co-author of the Time to Get It Right, Responsive and Effective Services for Marginalised Young People, a framework and a report we're releasing today. Marion, in fact, worked on this when she was undergoing stem cell transplant treatment. Anyone who's had any association with that procedure knows it takes you to the edge. But if you need hints on resilience, then Marion's here to help. This report and the best practice framework come at a time when the dominant narratives in the public discussion on young people and children in Australia paints a picture of future generation in trouble. We hear and see a constant stream of commentary and reporting that says our school-age children are not doing as well as their same-age international peers, that the mental health of young Australians is a public health crisis, with rates of mental illness defined in 2021 50% up in the 14 years since the previous survey. And we also hear, as Laura mentioned, that the nation is experiencing a youth crime crisis. Bad kids doing bad things in otherwise good communities, and demands for tougher action that amp up in reaction to every news report of a child or young person committing a serious crime. The reporting on the youth crime crisis is most shrill and reactive. It's creating division, fear and loathing. And we'll touch on those issues today. This is understandable because people have been hurt or worse. In response, Australian governments are committing more in funding for schools and for youth mental health services, essentially more money to do more of what we've already been doing. To address the community and media concerns on youth crime, state and territory governments in particular have turned to police flying squads in my own state of Queensland, youth curfews in the Northern Territory, military-style boot camps. Police might have them as well, but the military ones are the ones in question. Boot camps for young people that are seen to be going off the rails. And they're rapidly expanding the size and the number of youth detention facilities around the country. But beyond that, they're suspending children's rights to bail and increasing sentencing. There's vocal sections of the public through the media and social media are demanding tougher action with an immediate impact, what I would describe as they're looking for a silver bullet. Yet the evidence that these investments, a number of them, and the related actions will have the desired impact is really thin. In fact, there's clear evidence that many of the actions will in fact make our communities less safe, not safer. Put simply, the public discourse on youth crime ignores the broader social context for children and young people in Australia at present, and it certainly ignores the personal context for those children that are caught up in our youth justice system. Also absent from the conversation are the longer-term impacts for the nation and its prosperity. I want to first of all touch on aspects of the broader social context and the impact on young children. There's been several eminent Australians recently, Ken Henry, Ross Garnaut, even the radicals down there at the Productivity Commission have been talking about this, about the intergenerational tragedy confronting Australia that is of our own making. And what Ken Henry was referring to in that quote just a month ago was that the social compact between younger Australians and the rest of the community is breaking. Young people are subjected to an increasingly unfair tax system. Both he and Emeritus Professor Garnaut pointed to this, and Garnaut said basically young people are justified in feeling that the economy is stacked against them. Henry put it as they are screwed on tax. I wouldn't use such language. So, the tax system and housing is certainly part of the problem, but they're not the only contributing factors. And I would put it that the increasing precarious nature of employment has played a starring role for a long time in the situation for our young people. Precarious employment, so we're clear about what it is employment insecurity, income inadequacy, and the lack of rights and social protections that have been afforded to employees for many generations. It affects young people far more than older Australians. It is well established that precarious employment is associated with poorer mental health, I should say, and well-being. Indeed, if you had the intention of causing mental illness within a defined population, then the prescription you would write is uncertainty. Dose people up on uncertainty and you'll get mental illness. And we've been giving that prescription to our young people for a long time. Adding to the generational inequity is the HECS and HELP debt, which we've all heard about in recent times, and the continuing indexation issues. A $76 billion debt hanging over those that undertake study. The government's own Economic Inclusion Committee made a heap of recommendations at the beginning of last year on how to address some of these inequities. This is the Economic Inclusion Advisory Panel, which has many very fine people on it that understand the issues. It made a host of recommendations on policy. The first and foremost was addressing the inadequacy of the job seeker payments and the related payments. The government has not acted on that primary recommendation, and we remain today with a situation where those people on job seeker payments are living in abject poverty, and in a very deleterious situation for their health. The committee also made a heap of recommendations in relation to policies and funding announcements, funding initiatives around what are called place-based initiatives. This is where you take a whole community approach and you try and package the human service elements there to enable that community or a particular group in that community to lift themselves out of disadvantage. Sadly, the government's response to that has been pathetic. We have seen $63 million announced for 5 years of funding, so do the maths and you'll work out that that's a really small amount of money. We may as well spread confetti across the brown land and get a better result. It's simply not adequate, and that's to target 4 groups that are disadvantaged in terms of vocational access and employment outcomes. Young people, marginalised young people, 12 to 18, are just one of those groups. So the amount of money will make absolutely no difference. I suspect the committee itself was aware that the profound effects that repeated disengagement from employment or prolonged disengagement from employment, education and training, what we call NEETs, what that has on the mental health, alcohol and substance abuse and suicide attempts of young people. Intergenerational equality is the big issue, and if we don't address it and we simply focus on the 5,000 kids that are caught up in the youth justice system, we're missing the bigger issues. We've had an undeclared war on young people in Australia for a long time, and the consequences of this undeclared war are now absolutely clear. Mental illness amongst young people has skyrocketed in the last 15 years, certainly since I co-wrote the Not-for-Service report in 2006 and gave that to the Howard government. That issue has grown exponentially, youth mental illness. If we talk more about the specific context, the personal context for those kids that are caught up, and are more at risk in the crime situation. Marginalised, at-risk children and young people. Those who commit crimes are most often victims of crime and certainly witnesses of crime. Many have developmental, behavioural and or mental health problems. A significant number are born damaged with neurological impairments, in particular fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, and other significant physical impairments which they carry for life. This is a point that was starkly shown in the Telethon Institute's survey of the Banksia Detention Centre in Perth just a couple of years ago, where they looked at 99 children in that detention facility. 39 of those 99 had diagnosed FASD. 39. 9 out of 10 of those kids in that detention centre while the survey was being undertaken had severe, not mild, severe neurological disability. This is what we're doing to disabled kids. We're locking them up. We're incarcerating them. We're not providing care. Child maltreatment, let's talk about that. Last year, the first ever Australian child maltreatment study was released by QUT and colleagues, and it was a pretty damning report. It said that 4 in 10 young people aged 16 to 24 had experienced one or more forms of child maltreatment. Sadly, 25% of the respondents, more than 25%, 1 in 4, had experienced 3 to 5 forms of maltreatment, and often repeatedly. Now, what's the consequence of this? Well, the consequence is, on health, that when they assessed every single risk factor, the prevalence of them was much higher in those children that had been subject to maltreatment. They binge drink more, they smoke more, they are 6 times more more likely to be dependent on cannabis. They have obesity, they've engaged in self-harm and suicide at rates far and above even those with severe mental illnesses. And they are 3 times as more likely. So child maltreatment is a direct pathway to later mental health disorders. The authors state that nation-building reform is needed to protect children, and we need a strategic, systemic, evidence-based approach, and we need it now. We have the knowledge, we have the capability for transformational change. But do I see a strategic, sustained, systemic approach? No, I don't. What I see is more marginalised kids being subjected to exclusion from vocation and from education. If we just talk about education for a moment, the statistics on this are damning. They come from another team at QUT, my old alumni, the Centre for Inclusive Education. Go to their website, have a look at the data. It is shocking. In Australia right now, we are excluding more and more children from school, suspending them and excluding them. South Australian data says that those kids that are suspended 5 times or more in a year, 80% of them have a disability. In Queensland, the data says 63% of them are First Nations kids. In fact, if you're a First Nations kid in Queensland at a public school, you've got a 1 in 3 chance of being suspended. So that's one aspect of exclusion. Now, we don't have the data in Australia, but US data is very clear about this. It says that school exclusion is a pathway to prison, the school to prison pipeline. We start excluding kids as young as 4, which we're doing at the moment. This is where we're going to head. In addition to that school exclusion problem, we have now around 50,000 kids in Australia that are school refusals. It's not a very apt term, but it's where parents have decided their child is safer and better out of school. Now, it's not for ideological reasons, as some have suggested. The evidence, again from QUT, points to, and others, points to the fact that it's because their child has been subjected to repeated bullying, or they have neurological, behavioural or developmental disorders that the school is not catering for. We've got 50,000 kids today, more probably, that's data from more than a year ago, not in school. So, in comparison, the numbers of kids that are caught up in the youth detention system is small. There's about 5,000, fewer than 5,000 today that are actually in detention centres. The 17 detention centres around the country have got about 800 to 900 kids on any one day. Most of them have not been charged. They're there on remand, waiting a court hearing. And then we have about another 4,000 that are on community-based supervision. Of those kids that are in detention, surprise, surprise, 3 in 5, 60% again, are Indigenous. Indigenous kids are 29 times more likely to be in detention than their non-Indigenous peers. We have a lack of services for these children with developmental and behavioural problems before they go into detention and while in detention. Case after case from state and territories around the country illustrates this point. They are not getting the care that's needed. So we are very busy prescribing more mental illness for young people through the generational inequality, and we are pressurising this school to prison pipeline through failing to provide the care and the services that are needed for these children with developmental disorders that have been victims of child maltreatment. And we're excluding them increasingly from schooling and making it very difficult for them to be engaged in employment. And we're more likely to see complex mental health problems, substance abuse, suicidal behaviours and crime. The group of kids that Matt's organisation is trying to provide a different future for. So moreover, we are failing to put in place that strategic systemic approach and failing to make evidence-based investments for resilient generations and a prosperous nation. So there's no silver bullet to this, but there is what we would call silver buckshot. And that is, there's a lot of things that we know we can do to arrest this. The Australian Child Maltreatment Study pointed this out in relation to maltreatment. They said there's a clear body of evidence that we can follow. So the purpose of the framework that we're releasing today is really that the framework can be used for all services, but particularly those with a youth catchment or focus, to guide service design and delivery for all young people, but particularly those that are marginalised, that are not able, or they're not accessing the mainstream services such as GPs and Headspace. We have to educate staff and stakeholders about the range of interconnected skills and knowledge and attributes and service attributes that are needed. We can use it to inform advocacy efforts and support applications for funding and provide a framework for accountability. So it sets out what are those key elements that are necessary to make services effective for kids that have these greater challenges. We hope that by viewing these outcomes, these service outcomes through the lens of each young person, that will better enable services to create and deliver the services that meet the needs of marginalised and at-risk young people. There's a great body of evidence that supports the framework. The second thing that I would say we have to have as the National Commissioner for Children, and Holland's called for 2 years ago, we have to have national leadership. There is no national leadership on this at the moment. The states are running in all sorts of different directions without any sort of cross-jurisdictional collaboration. We're in breach of our international obligations in this area, I would argue, and we need that cross-jurisdictional collaboration, national leadership, harmonisation of laws and policies. We need it now. The third thing, as I've touched on, is we need a whole of government, whole of community response. Not just focusing on the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, but the broader issues driving marginalisation and greater risk for kids. We've got to start by arresting and reversing the generational inequities that exist in our nation. A universal basic income could be an important policy step in this direction, and there's good evidence from Canada, from the Scandinavian countries, that helps people who are in precarious employment situations. The Measuring What Matters framework that's been developed by Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, and the Department are a good start. but we need one specifically for young Australians, people under 25. We've got to measure what matters for them, and that's a good framework to begin the process of a whole of government, whole of community strategic approach to change. Fourthly, and I want to emphasise this point, we've got to fund what works. As the authors of all of those reports I've referred to, we know what works. So we've got to fund what works to reduce the prevalence and impacts of child maltreatment. We've got to fund what works for children subject to and at risk of educational exclusion and reverse the trend on school refusal. We've got to fund what works to overcome vocational and non-vocational barriers to economic participation. Again, we know what works in this space, particularly for marginalised people. We've got to fund what works for marginalised young people with more complex mental health problems and alcohol and drug issues. And we've got to fund what works in building social cohesion, because at the moment, particularly where communities are very agitated about youth crime, social cohesion is breaking down. Fifth point I would make is we've got to enable regional and community-led planning. It doesn't come out of Woden, it doesn't come out of George Street or Macquarie Street. It has to be centred around our regions and around our communities, because every one of them is different. They have different infrastructure, hard and soft infrastructure, and they've got different needs, different attributes and capabilities. So we have to enable that to occur across all the range of human services to get that place-based integration that's so lacking. We've got to educate and empower communities, because when we do, they make better choices. They make evidence-based in choices rather than irrational, reactive choices in terms of how to respond to these challenges. And finally, we've got to care before we incarcerate. Care before incarceration, and care in incarceration. If that is the last resort, if we do have to have some children held in detention, then it is absolutely essential that comprehensive assessment and care, personalised care, is provided in situ, because they have not had habilitation. They don't need rehab, they need habilitation. They've missed out. The cost to our nation of inaction or continuing the piecemeal approach we've had is immeasurable. I don't have a figure on it, and I don't think anyone could have. But we are building this big pipeline of problems with the alienation of generations. I want to thank the Press Club for the opportunity to converse and explore these critical issues confronting marginalised and at-risk younger Australians and the ways forward. And I want to hand over to Matt Noffs, whose organisation I have known since I began in this field in the early 80s. I used to have clashes with his granddad because I fundamentally disagreed with what he was on about. I loved his methods. He used to bring a bunch of syringes into Neville Rand's office, bang them on the desk and say, "Neville, we need action." And guess what? Mr. Rand followed that sort of invite. And Matt Noffs now leads that organisation 45 years later. Matt.
Thanks, John. In the coming decade, I want this country to be the safest country on earth, and I am dedicated to that cause. Our work can get a little bit heavy sometimes, the teams here, and we like having a laugh and finding the humour in things. And one of my favourite stories is told by a hero of mine, Kurt Vonnegut, the author. And he tells a story about a man who was sentenced to death in Chicago, and they were about to execute him. And as is the custom, they asked him if he had any final words, to which he replied, "Well, this will certainly teach me a lesson." What is the lesson that we've learned from the past 10 years when it comes to youth crime? I believe it is this: youth crime is treatable. When our first street university opened its doors in 2008 in Sydney's southwest, the youth crime rate was nearly double what it is today. Even with the little blip, as I'm calling it, that we're currently witnessing, the sharp decline in youth crime over the past decade surprisingly cannot be attributed to locking up more young people. We've locked up less and less young people in the past 7 years. Instead, the lesson has been to intervene early and treat instead of punish. Since the easing of COVID restrictions, many Australian communities have seen an upswing in the incidence of youth crime. And there is no doubt that this is extremely distressing for those communities. There's no doubt. So I want this recent upswing to be a blip, not a trend. So why aren't governments throwing the kitchen sink at this, as John asked? And I believe it's due to a trend I refer to as awayism. We often hear sections of the media and some politicians and community action groups advocate for harsher bail laws, curfews, tougher sentencing and the use of military-style boot camps to instil discipline into these scary criminals. These are all forms of awayism, the desire to send the kids away, anywhere but here. Now, if it worked, then I think it'd be hard to argue against it. Detention is perhaps the strongest form of awayism. Boot camps, in a way, are almost sold as a mild version of detention. Actually, some think they appeal to the penal populist in all Australians, in all of us. Either way, both detention and boot camps do the job of sending these kids away from their communities. They purport to work, but do they? A few years ago, the Northern Territory Department of Attorney General and Justice reported on a study of young people released from youth detention in the period from 2015 to 2019. It found that within 5 years, 61% ended up in an adult prison. And I strongly suspect that any manufacturer who had to recall 61% of its product within 5 years would quickly conclude that its original processes were deeply flawed. Incarceration begets incarceration. Just 11 short years ago, the Newman government in Queensland enthusiastically embraced the youth boot camp program, but the enthusiasm was short-lived. 4 centres were opened in isolated areas, 3 for so-called early intervention and 1 for sentenced youth. This spectacular failure lasted just 3 years and cost nearly $20 million in that time. It was more than twice as expensive as traditional youth detention, and there was a 63% recidivism rate from the sentence camp. In other words, same as youth detention, twice the price. To go down the boot camp path is to set ourselves against a positive future. Not simply a futile exercise, but a fundamentally flawed one that will set our children against us as we age. Now, let's not respond with an alleged proportional punishment. Let's be strategic. If we cannot be compassionate, let's be self-interested. And if we're interested in our future selves and our future safety, we must respond with constructive treatment that drives up opportunities for these kids. When these kids exhibit unsettling behaviour, it is worth noting that it is not always a willful drive towards anarchy, but a desperate plea for safety, for stability, and ultimately, as John said, care. We must recognise that these young people cause fear because they feel fear themselves. And that's part of our work and what we try and encourage, which is a greater appreciation of what it's actually like being in the shoes of these kids. Over the past 10 years, we've now grown to have 8 street universities across New South Wales, Queensland, and 1 here in the ACT, 5 minutes from here. The role of a street university is to engage with at-risk youth either before or as they're coming into contact with the youth justice system. And they are non-residential treatment centres that operate at different hours, most operating 10 till 7, some later. In Townsville, it's from lunch until late and 7 days a week. And they've got 2 functions: to engage at-risk young people, often through workshops, utilising things like music, studios, bike workshops, music, dance, tertiary style classes, but it's mainly the people there who work there that are the real reason that young people engage. And secondly, they treat. We work to get as many of those young people into counselling and treatment to reduce those issues related to crime and drugs. When governments, especially the federal government, where they've gone wrong time and time again is when they try to create a one-size-fits-all approach for every community. You can't treat engagement like it's a fast food chain. True treatment must involve the young people themselves in the creation of every space of every program. It is not difficult. We do it all the time. The federal government continues to pour billions into tired, tried and failed experiments propped up by this new church of one size fits all. It's an easy fix for government to fund one service, but it's a dangerous one. Again, both financially and also for the community. Sometimes the tried and true way of treatment isn't shiny enough for governments. Youth treatment is based on decades of research on what works, but it's never a sexy sell. Maybe that's the failing of people like me, to remind governments that their job is to do what works, not just what is appealing. Residential youth rehabs are so vital in the mix of youth justice and health. We created the first youth rehabs in Australia. We run 2 in New South Wales, 1 in Queensland and 1 here in the ACT. And these residential services were the first in the country to solely focus on adolescents with drug and crime related issues. Young people live there for approximately 3 months. They can leave at any time. If they're ordered to be there by a court, then the police have to come and pick them up. And the only option for them then is youth detention if they choose to leave. And this is where we do need youth detention in the mix. In the youth justice landscape, different jurisdictions deal with diversionary measures in different ways. And I couldn't possibly go into detail of each of them. They're too complex. I can say this. One of the reasons we get such good results from young people being rehabilitated through our residential youth rehabs is that more often than not, a magistrate orders a young person to be there. And if that's the case, then their only other option is detention, as I've said. The process is referred to as court-ordered, and it is not the same as mandatory treatment. The main difference being that the young person has a choice to be there between detention and rehab. The court order is issued by the magistrate, and the young person is often given the chance between detention and our facility. So you might be asking yourself, how is this not a form of awayism? Well, there are 5 distinct reasons why it's not. First is, despite the backdrop of detention as the alternative, the young people always have the choice to be there or to leave. Secondly, the residential service is a therapeutic community. Thirdly, we're not taking them away from their family. Families can visit. 4, depending on the court order, the young person can go home and practice what they've been learning. And 5, as opposed to sentence or a punishment, this is neither. It is an opportunity for them. Yes, it has arrived as a consequence of a crime often that they've committed, but it's an opportunity for them to work on their own issues. Having the backdrop of detention certainly helps motivate a young person. Again, having detention is important, but not every young person, I can hear people ask, not every young person is remorseful, and some are too dangerous to be left unsupervised in the community, so what about them? There is no other place that we've created in our society for the very few highly dangerous individuals. And so you have a sense of it, and John talked to this. As I've said, there are 800 kids in detention currently across the country, out of a population of 26 million. As a guess, there would be less than a quarter of those that would need to be locked up. And even then, we could be bringing, as John said, treatment into detention to work with them. That is 200 kids out of 26 million. 200 kids. So when the next time you're watching the front of the papers, you're watching those reports, remember, 200 are the very, very worst that we don't know what else to do with. But whatever we do with the 200, let it be treatment. Treatment inside detention is not a new idea. Right here in the ACT is the Alexander McConaughey Centre, which is a prison, yet has a therapeutic community operating on one part of it. The point here is that while we need detention centres, we can transform them tomorrow by adding treatment rather than just being incarceration. But we need evidence too, as John said. Both Australian universities and our youth rehabs have been internationally peer-reviewed, which is incredibly rare in our field. One study which used linked data showed significant reductions in crime, including violent crimes, post-treatment for over half a decade. Another study showed significant reductions in hospitalisations amongst young people with criminal convictions, and all studies show significant reductions in problematic drug use and suicidal ideation. This is what Queensland MPs refer to as the gold standard. Not self-evaluated, but externally evaluated by universities and peer-reviewed at an international level. It's not as if we don't have the evidence. When states like Queensland, Tasmania and the Northern Territory are desperate for kitchen items to throw at the problem, again, I ask them to focus on the evidence that exists. I'd love to see the development of a national youth crime strategy akin to those we currently have in place for other matters such as drug use, housing and natural disaster resilience. But we can't wait the years it would take. We can't wait that long. Prime Minister, put this on the agenda for the National Cabinet, and in the meantime, make it a priority for your government to lead a cross-jurisdictional response. Can I take the time now to thank the following people who have been an incredible part of the journey across all of our work. Firstly, to our staff, some are here, who do a really difficult job, sometimes not only not thanked, but vilified in the community when they see these kids descend upon our places. But if it wasn't for them, we couldn't do what we do. Knives brandished, holes punched in walls by a kid coming off ice. Our people do this every day. They manage this issue every day. Thank you. I also want to thank police forces all the way from ACT through to New South Wales to Queensland, who are a significant part of our success. In particular, there are two Queensland senior officers, Greg Orbit and Matty Lyons, both who have worked endlessly to help create symbiotic relationships between the street universities and the police that serve those communities that they're in. Can I thank the ACT government for their responsiveness to new ideas, the New South Wales government for funding more treatment services to keep up with the issue, and the Queensland government for always having us at the table when it matters most. I also want to thank Laura and Morris for having us today, having John and myself to speak today. But I want to end with a quote from Winston Churchill that, funnily enough, Andrew Lee sent me, along with his excellent paper titled The Second Convict Age, explaining the return of mass imprisonment in Australia. And I'm so thankful that there are people in government who know, as John said, how expensive and dangerous incarceration without evidence-based treatment can become. On the issue of crime and criminals, Winston Churchill said, "The mood and temper of the public in regard to the treatment of crime and criminals is one of the most unfailing tests of the civilization of any country. A calm and dispassionate recognition of the rights of the accused against the state, and even convicted criminals against the state. A constant heart-searching by all charged with the duty of punishment, a desire and eagerness to rehabilitate in the world of industry all those who have paid their dues in the hard coinage of punishment. Tireless efforts towards the discovery of curative and regenerating processes, and an unfaltering faith that there is a treasure, if you can only find it, in the heart of every man. These are the symbols which in the treatment of crime and criminals mark the measure of the stored up strength of a nation and are the sign and proof of the living virtue in it." Churchill says it himself, a constant heart-searching, a desire and eagerness to rehabilitate, tireless efforts toward the discovery of curative and regenerating processes, an unfaltering faith that there is a treasure if only you can find it. If only we can find it. If only Queensland can find it. If only the Prime Minister can find it. Churchill uses those exact words, treat and rehabilitate. And we find those treasures daily in the young criminals we work with at Ted Noffs Foundation. And the virtue is in the cold, hard, dispassionate facts of science. Internationally peer-reviewed papers that use linked data to discover where these young former criminals, some who had committed terrible crimes half a decade later, and upon seeing this data, seeing that the crimes had dropped away, seeing the violence had dropped away, when can we learn the lessons of our past, our own trauma as a nation, knowing that crime begets crime, punishment begets punishment, hurt begets hurt. We are all only here because those before us not only envisioned a better Australia, but also cut ties with our bloody past, with the opposition, with the oppression we had all been under since the very start and birth of Australia, and that our criminal and punitive history was transformed into one of safety and opportunity. We are the country that was sent away from Britain, only to become a new country unto ourselves, safer than the US is today, safer than England is today. Here, we have done things differently for the past half century and have succeeded in keeping crime at low levels. It is largely thanks to our parents, who for many were belted by their parent and then became the protector of their children. The next generation around, for every aggression a compassion, for every impulse to punish a patience, and instead for every crime a consequence, but one that has the intention to create a stronger, more resilient young Australian. Our leaders, state and federal, are our country's parents, and in this regard I am calling on this generation of leaders to be the leaders who, like former generations, cut the ties with their hurt and invest in a future that is free from abuse, free from punishment, and full of opportunity. Australia can be the safest country on earth. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John and Matt, for a couple of very powerful presentations, and there's a lot to unpack there, from the really broad to the narrow. And I want to start with a question which in some ways sort of sounds, you know, a fairly small thing, but I just thought it was notable. And in answering, I'm sort of interested in trying to draw out all the threads of what you've both been talking about. And that was just that you mentioned that there'd been this upswing since COVID. What's your feeling about what's behind that? You know, are there particular factors in there?
So crime has been going down generally for decades, like right across the known universe. And the reason for that is boring in a way, but it's largely things like technology, you know, being able, you know, cameras and so on to be able to deter, if not find criminals. But largely, we have created more opportunities in developed nations, and that allows for young people to have to rely on things like drug dealing less, for instance. So when you have something like a pandemic come along, a lot of the kids we work with, as John said, are already living in pandemic-like or lockdown-like situations. And so it really is trauma heaped upon trauma. And when those opportunities started to come away, it was easier for young people to get caught up in that. It was obvious that these things were going to happen. But there's some other basic things there. They were allowed to wear, as I said, they're allowed to wear masks and run around. You could see minor things happen, more vandalism and so on. So it was natural that that was going to happen. The problem is that we're kind of still suffering from that. And so we're still at the element where we can make that a blip, but it's really come off the back of COVID and the lack of those opportunities. And the government hasn't really caught up in kind of providing more of those. For instance, the youth allowance itself, is just so difficult for a young person to live on. Around $400 a fortnight, I believe, for a young person who lives at home, and $600 if they live by themselves. I don't know. There's nothing. I think the Productivity Commission found that there was nothing that they could find for a young person to rent at that. So it's a basic thing. If you don't give young people the most basic opportunities to get ahead, of course, drug dealing, for instance, as one example, becomes a very easy way to try and survive. And COVID really was that beginning of that pressure.
I think just to add to Laura, two of the things that we saw happen during the pandemic, which were really good safety nets for the well-being of the community and had significant impacts for a lot of people. We took every homeless person off the street around the nation. Every city in the country put our homeless populations in decent accommodation. You know, no questions asked. They were in there. They were in there primarily because they were seen as a public health risk to the broader population. It reminded me of what we did during the AIDS epidemic. You know, we did everything we could to stop the transmission of HIV back then, and it worked. So that group of people certainly had a moment where, oh, hang on, I've got a sort of a normal life. I can have some security. I've got some tenure to things, and I can start to think about my life beyond living from day to day. We also gave that universal basic wage to people through JobKeeper. A lot of people missed out, we know that, but the bulk of the population didn't, and that lifted people. So people who are on minimum payments got more as a result during that period. So I think, you know, then taking them away, that's probably been a contributing factor without having any direct science on it.
Sure. And I'll just ask another one before I open it to the floor, but just trying to get into that issue of, you know, obviously there, as you both say, there aren't that many kids in youth detention, though there's so much focus on them, but there are all of these big structural problems facing young people in Australia. So I want to just give you a scenario which comes from a friend of mine, and just maybe get you to reflect on the sorts of things that your proposals would change. So a friend of mine was the principal of a suburban primary school. She had some kids with all the sorts of difficulties that you've been highlighting here. And on a couple of occasions, their parents would bring them into her office and say, oh, I can't deal with him, he's your problem now. And so she had the immediate issues of trying to find somewhere safe for him to be. There are obviously, there are also behavioural issues that she was having to deal with as a school principal. I mean, I think schools are under such immense pressure now, whether it's through these issues or through autism problems or all sorts of other things. What are the various aspects of that story that would have to be or can be addressed?
Well,
I'm happy to have it.
Okay.
Laura, look, there's good evidence from around the world. In fact, I did a study with colleagues for the Queensland government back in 2015, looking at a program up there called EdLink, and it was linking schools with specialist child and youth mental health services, not the Headspace services, but with the specialist state-run child and youth services. And what the main focus was really about building the capacity of the schools to better identify, better respond to those emerging behavioural, developmental issues and getting the right care at the right time in school. And then when you had more complex cases, having small group programs within the school, supported by those external experts. And then when needed, that smaller number again of kids that needed then the specialist ongoing support from the child and youth, those pathways to care were there. But not taking them out of school, not eliminating them from school, keeping them there and building the capacity of the school. Now, unfortunately, we've not followed and scaled up that model in my state, nor around the country. And what we tend to be doing is pumping more money in terms of school psychologists, operating pretty much as sole practitioners without a model of care and without that multidisciplinary approach. We do need multidisciplinary skilled teams working hand in glove with the educators in school and the other supports That's what I think we're missing at the moment. And schools are struggling, there's no question. When I spent some time in the Kimberley with a group of 23 principals from remote areas, they've got enormous challenges, but they've also demonstrated what they can do when they've got the resources. They do tremendous work.
Do you want to say something about that, Matt? Or?
Well, I just think that's a really common issue that we find. To give you an example, on the Gold Coast, a lot of the young people we work with there, some as young as 11 who are homeless. It's hard for people to believe that there can be 11-year-old homeless kids in surfers paradise, but there are, and they come and use our space, and the parents don't want them, schools struggle to keep them there. So the reality is that places like the Street University becomes the only option. And so, you know, you really need to kind of help work with that young person. If there is a principal who is willing to help, that's amazing. They're often quite busy themselves doing important work. So linking the young people into housing, into support. If there is an opportunity to go home, sometimes the home is too scary. It's one of the issues that we've got, I believe, that Alice Springs might be facing with the curfew. I mean, one of the issues is that being locked up for some of these kids inside their own homes is the most dangerous place. So we need a lot more in terms of not only early intervention and things like street universities, we actually just need a roof over the head for a lot of young people. Here in the ACT is a significant youth homelessness issue. And we actually fund our own house here where young people can live while they're looking for longer term accommodation. So everyone's really struggling at the moment. It was already a problem. COVID certainly kind of turned it on, and I think it's very difficult for schools. But the reality is a lot of these kids we're talking about will never go to school. And even sometimes alternative education won't get them in the door. So I just think we really need to focus on this idea. Again, I come back to this self-interested idea. A government should say, well, this young person is certainly primed to become a serious criminal. If I can't find any compassion for them, what can I do to help the school, to help the community, to help all of us save the burden of how much money it's going to cost keeping them in prison if they do get locked up and the crime that goes along the way? It's a far better investment at the moment. And as John said, the government's kind of throwing their money, doing all this kind of stuff. They're not being strategic.
Okay. Julie Hare has a question.
Thank you both very much. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. Just hearing you talk about homeless 11-year-olds made me think that we're back in the age of Charles Dickens, but anyway. This is kind of a follow-on from Laura's question. I don't know whether you've answered this in some way, Matt, but I'm just wondering about the education system. Australia's education system has been going down on a fairly steep trajectory since 2000, and we now have levels of illiteracy where 1 in 4 Year 9 boys are what I call functionally illiterate. We have a long tail of disadvantage and underperformance in the school system. There is work going on to try and change the way that people are taught in schools, but how much does the failure of the school system itself, and also segregation, rich kids separated from poor kids, no, comprehensive high schools, or almost a thing of the past. Could you talk me through kind of where school fits in this, especially when we're dealing with really dysfunctional families?
Yeah. So I don't know what John would think about this, but there's a few different aspects to that. I think the creation of Headspace really came out of really due to a failure of the education system. So many of the kids who use Headspace have issues with the HSC alone. And it's not an uncommon thing. Speak to so many parents who have kids going into year 11 who are getting anxious, getting depressed because they're told that this is their only opportunity to go and, get into university. So I kind of see so much money going to something like Headspace for, essentially, a lot of middle class kids with issues we should be dealing with, anxiety and depression. But I also kind of look back at the education system and say, what is it about year 11 and 12 that we're getting wrong? The reality is no one's going to university much anymore anyway. It's a real struggle I've got universities asking me if I can help to get more young people into universities. So it's a huge struggle there. I think, again, it's a problem, as you're saying, with how we're thinking about high school. Going back to what you're saying about illiteracy and those other issues, I think, again, this one size fits all. This is how governments think about it. It's easy for them. Can they just do one thing? Can they do the same thing? Let's plug more money at it. I really think it's time to kind of clear the decks. And when we're looking at all these issues, I think school has to be one of those things. High school, I'm really talking about, really from year 7. But then, to your point, in remote communities, why are we doing it the same way? Why aren't we saying there are different sorts of education? For a First Nations community, actually having a part of their cultural makeup is a really important part of that. That happens in some places, but it doesn't happen in all places. Again, because that sort of co-design I was talking about with youth spaces that we do with the Street University. So the Townsville Street University is very different to the Southport Street University, is different to the ACT one, and you get the kids to work through it, and they change all the time, from the posters on the wall to the classes being taught. The kids lead that. I kind of talk about this idea. My grandparents started the Wayside Chapel, and at the time they called it Bob Dylan's den. It was beatniks and hippies and everyone walking around listening, writing poetry and doing that, and that was right for the time. Today it's hip hop. Who knows what it'll be 20 years from now. But the point that I think that my grandfather did get right was actually listening to the young people and saying, well, what do you want? Absolutely. And I don't think the government does that. I think we do it in tokenistic ways. And I think we can really look to places like Scandinavia and say, what are they getting right when it comes to high school? And I think it's really time to try new things. I think the government's seeing this broken thing, piling money there, piling money over there, piling money over here, and saying it's just easy for them. I'm sorry to say this, but I do think it's a little bit, what we're seeing with the current government is a very vanilla government who's just doing the same things. But they are going to be blamed for something that really isn't just their problem. It's the governments for the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. This government has an opportunity not to be vanilla, but to be a flavour that really listens to the communities, listens to young people, and can change high school. And you're going to save a lot of money, and you're going to probably make a lot of money for Australia too, improve so many outcomes, help universities, for Christ's sake, really, and help them in that way. So, yeah, that's a bit of a broad brushstroke to your question, but yeah.
Dare I mention Gonski?
Oh, yeah.
Let's level the playing field. Inequity in Australian schooling is greater than virtually every other nation on earth. Okay? And that is a big contributing factor to the educational outcomes we're achieving. We have a grossly inequitable system. We are treating unequals equally. So the kids in Derby are getting the same as the kids in...
Yeah, one size fits all.
Yeah. So we've got to do better in terms of the distribution of resources for schooling. I'll just add this, Julie, that Matt mentioned in some traditional communities, remote schools, we're seeing remarkable things done where we're blending traditional knowledge with Western ways of doing science. And I saw some of this in the Kimberley last year. Tremendous work where the elders are coming into the classroom, they're learning about the curriculum, they're learning how to integrate their traditional knowledge with that. They're then taking the kids and going with the school staff on country and applying that knowledge. They're then coming back into the class for that. So there's not only a better educational outcome for the kids, but the community values education. They can see that this has got real value for them and their children and their opportunities. East Kimberley District High School in Connetica is a standout example of where this has been applied across a whole range in the arts. Their arts display was phenomenal in terms of the application of two ways of learning and thinking. So I would really say, look, we see pockets of excellence, islands of excellence around the country, but we just do not scale these and we don't resource them to enable them to continue. So they fall over when the principal at Wonkajenka or at Kununurra is gone. it goes. We've got to ensure that we can sustain that momentum and build on that success.
Nick Stewart.
Quickly, first of all, Rishi Sunak's come up with national service as the answer. Obviously, you guys don't think that's the way.
Gee, that's a surprise.
Would some sort of alternative like national service, city or University of Life, Street University, is there some other alternative that might help actually a society replace families, what families should theoretically be doing in terms of looking after our kids? And secondly, if I can, how disappointed are you when you have a Prime Minister now who is from a broken home, from a housing commission place, who got free university paid for by the state, which he never had to pay back? How much do you think that we can personalise? I mean, what would your appeal be to Anthony Albanese? What are you saying to him?
I'll do that. Can I do that? Pardon you. Do
Sure,
this.
sure.
Go back to the one. Yeah. So my appeal to Anthony Albanese is exactly as you said. You've come from exactly the same sorts of backgrounds we're talking about with these young people. You've got a free university education, which would ultimately straight away, bring so many more kids in, be not as worried about the HSC, not as worried about, financially and so on for their future. I think, Mr. Albanese, you and the Treasurer are too obsessed about having a surplus, not having a deficit, more to the point, than you are thinking about the future. All of us are going to be lumped with far greater deficits coming into the future. Ask Andrew Lee, if you let this keep going, this is going to be far worse. So your very own story could be the story for so many of these young people. And as we've been saying, we're talking about, at the very, very, very worst, 200, 800 in all detention, maybe 5,000 of 26 million. So to answer your question, I'd say just do exactly that. We know the answer, do it. Yes, it's going to cost money. Yes, it'll probably mean a deficit, but I think most Australians would appreciate to become the safest country on earth. That's how we do it.
Nick, many moons ago, I used to engage kids and lead kids in adventure education, outdoor education. In fact, I was the inaugural president of the Queensland Rock Climbing Instructors Association and wrote the first national competency framework for that particular activity, so that kids wouldn't kill themselves or something out abseiling and rock climbing. Adventure training, to go to your point about Rishi Sunak's initiative, has great value, and we've known that for a long time. Our current king came to Geelong Grammar and went bush for a term and learnt a lot about himself in that term in Year 9 or thereabouts that he went bush. There's great value in that, but that is structured adventure training. We've got a good curricula around how to do that. Schools have been risk managed out of doing any of that. I could not do what I did back in the 80s with kids now. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't be allowed, or I'd have to have a risk management plan 3 times the size of that. So that's unfortunate, and I think we can bring that back into curriculum, into schooling. That would be a very good thing. It's only the elite schools that offer that experience for kids nowadays, by and large. So, but national service, that's a really dumb idea. We've got a Royal Commission just about winding up about the trauma inflicted by brutality in the training of young people as they go into the military. Let's not repeat that on a grand scale.
I don't think giving a lot of the kids who are causing crimes guns.
No, it's not a great idea.
We're unfortunately running close to time now, but we've got a final question from Martin Fisk.
I'll be very short. Martin Fisk from Worldview Foundation. We're an Aboriginal community organisation that helps young Aboriginal people either stay out of jail if they're at risk of going in or not go back if they've been in. And I wanted to ask you the question, statistically, if you're in prison today as a young person, you've only got a 1 in 2 chance of not going back within 2 years upon release. But if you're an Aboriginal young person, you've only got a 1 in 3 chance of not going back and repeating the cycle. If you've got a mum or dad who's been in prison or had contact in the justice system, you've only got a 1 in 4 chance statistically. So the cards are stacked against you. As politicians, as NGOs, as members of society, what can we do to stop that cycle of recidivism?
Well, I think we've largely tried to address it. Hopefully we've nailed some of the points, maybe not all, but I think more than anything else, opportunity. I think diversity. I think the government's very scared of diversity. They like just doing one thing, but every community, no First Nations person, First Nations people are not a homogenous blob. No young people are not a homogenous blob. You know, you need to work with every single community, and it is not a difficult task, as John's saying. It's really about just dedicating yourself to it. And so I think it's the same thing. I think it's really about saying we're not doing enough for First Nations communities. And if we can't find it in our heart to be compassionate enough to do more for communities that are living in poverty, then be self-interested, you know, as a government, as governments, and say, this is how we're going to reduce recidivism, this is how we're going to bring crime down by some of these very basic levers. So there are big levers that we can pull, that we've been talking about. Make university free again, okay? Universal basic income, some that other countries have just said, yep, screw it, we're mucking around, let's do it. And they've pulled these levers with significant results that have made the countries better. And we're falling behind because we're pulling these little levers everywhere. But if we're going to at least figure out, be strategic about which ones we're going to do. What John's saying is the government's looking at this panel and they're going, oh, I guess we've just been pushing these for a while, let's just hope it keeps working. And it's not. So I don't know if you might have a...
To build on that very quickly, Martin, we've seen really good examples here in the ACT. 20 families, I think it was, that were receiving wraparound, family-centred support, not to necessarily cut recidivism, but because they were the ones drawing on an enormous amount of resources through different streams of funding across different portfolios, but with nothing connecting and nothing changing. So that family-centred wraparound model works a treat, whether it's in relation to recidivism, cutting that, whether it's in relation to jobless families and lifting them out of that poverty. We had a brilliant pilot under the Gillard government, didn't get refunded. I've spoken to Jim Chalmers about this, and have a look at this, mate. This is a really good proven model. Let's do it again. So we know how those family-centred wraparound programs can work and change fundamentally that intergenerational pattern. So place-based, family-centred, they're the sort of themes that we need to see, as well as the big policy levers that Matt's just referred to.
Thank you.
So many things that you've raised with us today, so thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your views, and please thank our speakers today.
Thanks for having us.